Well, I think that's a very big question you're asking me there, and the answer will not be just a one-liner. It'll have to be a little bit more dense than that. I think the first thing to understand is that the Atlantic has changed over the years. If you go back in the centuries, there have been huge changes in the Atlantic and in maritime activities on the Atlantic. If you go back to, for example, the slave trade, which marked large parts of Africa, what is now Latin America, and of course the United States and the Caribbean. So that was the beginning, but after that you had the development, of course, of colonies in Africa and in South America in particular. You had the growth eventually of industry and trade. And I think it's the trade routes which have most marked the Atlantic. The trade routes which themselves have changed over the years. If you think, for example, of the building of the Suez Canal in the 19th century, there's the building of the Panama Canal. These both changed Atlantic trade routes considerably. In fact, what they both did was to cut down the number of ships which passed by the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and by Cape Horn in South America. And that led really to a much calmer situation in the Atlantic, except in the area where there has always been economic activity, and that, of course, is fisheries. Fisheries has been the lifeblood of, for example, countries or coastal populations, I should say, along the west coast of Africa. And indeed, in Northern Europe, I was brought up on the North Sea between the United Kingdom and the continent of Europe. The North Sea was once a place where you could actually see thousands and thousands and thousands of fish jumping out of the sea all the time. No longer. We've overfished the North Atlantic now. And one of the things which has been happening is that the fisheries which used to be in the North Atlantic have been overfished, and fisheries have developed in the South Atlantic as technology has led to bigger fishing vessels, more powerful fishing vessels, different types of fishing gear which allow more fish to be caught. And that's where the great stretches of the Atlantic have suddenly become places where fish are caught and where great fish like the big tunas have been gradually being caught, being fished out, and where we're left with smaller and smaller animals, smaller and smaller species in the Atlantic. So those, I think, are two of the trends which I think you can pick out for the Atlantic as a whole. And luckily, one of the things we can say, particularly about the South Atlantic, is that it has really never been a theatre for operations by navies. It's not been securitized, as the experts say. It's been a very peaceful region. And that's perhaps one of the things that we would like to retain in the future. That, of course, is under threat now through things like piracy and armed robbery in the Gulf of Guinea. It's under threat from terrorism, perhaps, and it's under threat from illegal activities like the trafficking of people, the trafficking of drugs across the Atlantic, and that's something which we can't look on, I think, with equanimity at the moment. It's something which is developing and which we don't like at all. Oh, I think it's fairly clear that the centre of gravity is shifting. The centre of gravity is shifting from what we used to call the Western nations, from the First World, to what used to be called the Third World. We don't really talk about the Third World any longer. We talk about emerging economies. And we have those in the South Atlantic. Countries like Brazil, countries like South Africa, Namibia. These are growing very fast and are becoming really strong world players, making an impact on the world economy and on world trade. And indeed, one of the latest things that people talk about is the phenomenon of Africa rising, of high growth rates in many of the African countries. And of course, all this will have an impact on Atlantic trade flows. There are new ports being constructed, new deep water ports on the coast of Brazil, and indeed in Africa as well, in places like Walvis Bay. And of course, I've just been driving today through the port of Casablanca, which is expanding. It may be only 100 years old, but it's now growing in a way that I think it didn't for a very long time. So it's clear that the center of gravity in economic terms is shifting. But it's also shifting in other ways. I already mentioned a little bit fisheries. The great European fishing fleets of countries like Spain used to fish almost exclusively in the North Atlantic. They don't now. The Spanish fishing fleet now fishes in the Western Indian Ocean and to a very large extent in the Southeast Atlantic Ocean. And this is pushed by largely by agreements between the European Union and West African countries, where the West African countries basically sell their fishing rights to European Union vessels. This is a change which has happened since the introduction of the so-called exclusive economic zones as a result of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And I'm not sure it's altogether for the good of the West African countries in the longer term. And the reason is that we now have at least, I think, over 50% of the fish stocks of the Southeast Atlantic are now overfished. In other words, what's being done there is not sustainable in the long run. That is not a good idea. Now, the other development, which is very important, I think, in terms of the shift of economic activity from the north to the south, is the discovery of large oil and gas reserves, both in the Gulf of Guinea and off the coast of Brazil. The Gulf of Guinea is now the second largest area for oil and gas reserves in the world. And as this continues to be exploited, we have a shift of activity from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, to the southern Atlantic. And this brings with it, income, of course, it brings with it jobs. Unfortunately, it also brings with it criminality. And one of the things we have to say, unfortunately, is that criminal activity has also been shifting from the North Atlantic to the south. The reason for that is probably not just that criminals find a good place to work in the South Atlantic, but that governments find it difficult to stop them. If I can put it in very simple fashion, the policing of the North Atlantic is very much better carried out than the policing of the South Atlantic. The countries of the South Atlantic don't have the surveillance capacities, they don't have the Coast Guard capabilities, and they often don't have the legal systems to be able to deal with the activities which are developed, like robberies, like hijacking, like piracy, and like the trafficking, which I mentioned earlier. So all these things mean that both the opportunities, the economic opportunities, and the risks to human security in the South Atlantic are developing at the moment much faster than in the North Atlantic, which is basically stagnant, we could say, in all these areas. Perhaps the biggest difference between the South Atlantic and the North Atlantic in terms of governance is that in the North Atlantic, we have had for many years transatlantic partnerships, particularly between the EU and the United States and Canada, the major players in the North Atlantic. And of course, also in the security field, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. These links across the Atlantic don't exist to anything like the same extent in the South Atlantic. There are, of course, bilateral relations between some Latin American countries and some African countries, but they're only bilateral. There aren't any organizations which group together the two sides of the South Atlantic to perform common projects, to talk together about how to improve the opportunities and how to deal with the risks. This is partly, of course, a question of resources. We'd be able to deal much better with the illegal activities in the South Atlantic if we had reliable data coming in all the time from satellite surveillance over the South Atlantic. There are plenty of low Earth orbiting satellites flying over the South Atlantic all the time, but somebody has to pay for the data from them to identify what is going on in the seas, to find out which are the vessels engaging illegal activities, and then to pass that information on to coastal governments so that they can deal with them. But that requires money, and at the moment nobody is paying it. My own view is really quite simple. The countries of the Northern Atlantic have the same interests as those of the South in dealing with this illegal behavior, but they have far more resources, and therefore they should basically be the ones to pay for this. This would be an investment both in development in the Southern Atlantic and in the security of the economic interests of the northern countries who use the South Atlantic. One should add, I think, also that there are North Atlantic countries who also have sovereignty over large parts of the South Atlantic. If you think of the United Kingdom, it has sovereignty at the moment over the Falkland Islands, sometimes called the Malvinas, but also over a series of islands in the South Atlantic like St. Helena, Tristan da Cunha, Ascension Island, and similarly you have other northern countries like Portugal, which have large interests in the south because we have extremely close relations to their former colonies, the largest of which, of course, is Brazil, but also countries like Angola, the Cape Verde Islands, and so on. So I think northern countries have both an interest in the South Atlantic and a responsibility to see it as something that they share responsibility for, and therefore they should be willing to provide the resources to help to do something about this. That, of course, won't help if the South Atlantic countries themselves don't develop a consciousness that there are problems which need to be dealt with, and they should be dealing with them together. And up till now, I don't see the governmental initiatives from Latin America and from West Africa which would lead to such a consciousness developing, preferably in the form of some more formal discussions taking place every year, perhaps several times, with working groups on what should be done. And I would hope very much that at some stage this could be facilitated and could start, and the South Atlantic would move towards having a much more developed system of common governments, rather like that which exists in the North Atlantic.